Hi everyone. So I just want to quickly talk you through my own analysis of the poem that we looked at in class today, which is Immigrants at Central Station. So as you have already read, the poem is actually telling the story of the poet's parents who were in transit for over 2 years during about 1949 to 51, and they left Poland to come to Australia. So in that 2 years, they were either physically traveling or they were staying in a hostel. And so it took them 2 years to actually get to Australia and start their new life. So as we've spoken about today, one of the things that you needed to do was start to think about what authorial choices you could find and the meaning of those authorial choices. And what we're aiming to do in Monday's lesson and what we've already started to think about is how does that connect to identity? Okay, so if you have a look at this first stanza where it says, the air was crowded with a dampness that slowly sank into our thoughts. So this particular part of the stanza obviously is using lots of figurative language, but a lot of sensory imagery. So when we say sensory imagery, we're really talking about the fact that the imagery is appealing to our five senses, and it creates a visual depiction of the isolation that was evident and also the depressing atmosphere that it's created. So through the use of those words, we can see cold, damp as well, empty streets, the silence. That all elicits a dark and depressing and very gloomy atmosphere. It then says in the second stanza that time waited anxiously with us. So that again is the personification of time. And the idea behind this, the poet's intention here is to help us to visualize how anxious it was for these immigrants to sit and to wait for the next stage of their journey. Now, in the next line, year 10, it says behind upturned collars. So I want you to think about who might those upturned collars belong to. Are they guards? Are they onlookers? Are they security? What's meant by upturned collars? There's also juxtaposition in this stanza when the poet says, and space hemmed us against each other. So the juxtaposition is evident because when we think of hemming, the word hemmed or hemming means to sew something down, or to attach it closely or to fasten it to something. And space obviously is the opposite of that because we often think of, a wide open space or a gap. So that juxtaposition there follows on again when the poet starts to talk about the fact that the space had hemmed them together against each other like cattle brought for slaughter. So this section of the stanza, paired with that juxtaposition, the simile now of the cattle brought for slaughter helps we as the reader to visualize the helplessness of the situation and the helplessness that's felt by the immigrants. It also explains to us and helps us to understand how crowded the immigrants are. When you think of cattle before they're brought for slaughter, they're often loaded onto a trailer, quite closely and tightly packed. There's little care in how they're put onto this trailer and how much space they have between them. And they are there on this journey to the slaughterhouse, just awaiting their fate. So perhaps the immigrants here also, the idea of this is that the immigrants are also awaiting their fate here, like cattle brought for slaughter. If you think of animals right before that moment where they are slaughtered, and it's quite a graphic and confronting image for us to think about, but to be lamed like an animal right before slaughter, what kind of emotions does that invite the reader to feel? When we compare cattle brought for slaughter with the immigrants, what kind of emotions does that invite us to feel? Have a think about that and perhaps note some down because it's a very powerful line. In the next stanza, year 10, you can see that the poet talks about the fact that families stood by with blankets and packed cases. There were kids, children by their sides. And then the author says, as the poet says, watching pigeons that watched them. So here in this particular part of the stanza and the poem, we really start to feel the weight of the weight, the burden of the endless waiting in that moment, the stillness of the moment. There's nothing happening. You can hear a pin drop. And there was really nothing to do except watch these pigeons who are watching them. So you can imagine that emptiness, that hollowness of that moment. It's also interesting that the author, the poet, I keep saying author, my apologies, the poet chooses to highlight these pigeons. When we think of pigeons, guys, they're not really the most attractive bird. They are not the most free bird. Quite often they're found in public places like piazzas, street areas, the rafters of buildings, or quite often in train stations, and they're always huddled. And in that moment, it's almost like those pigeons who are watching those people had more of a home than those people did, which is quite ironic when you consider the fact that a pigeon is kind of like a vagabond bird. It just goes from one place to the next. And this last stanza, the last two little sections of this poem, but it was sad to hear the trains whistle so suddenly. So that, again, there's a change in pace, a sudden change in pace. Suddenly the watching and the waiting is over. The train interrupts that still pace of the poem. And obviously there's that repetition. It was sad to hear the whistle, which was repeated in the first stanza of the poem in the opening. Lastly, guys, the poet talks about the fact that suddenly the signal at the platform's end turned red and it dropped like a guillotine. So there's the simile again. A guillotine is a piece of equipment that was traditionally used during the French Revolution for beheading people, actually. And in more modern times now, it's often used by engineers, mechanical engineers, as an instrument to slice or to cut industrial materials like stainless steel. So again, that idea of comparing the train, or the platform's red light, that signal, comparing it with death kind of signifies that, this is their fate perhaps, and the unknown is coming perhaps. And lastly, year 10, while time ran ahead, again, there's the personification of time. And it symbolizes that, time is either running ahead without them, or perhaps it's running ahead, leading them to their next unknown destination. So the end of the poem is quite ambiguous and quite vague. And it really does leave it up to your own interpretation as well. Did they make the train? Or were they on the train the whole time, waiting, packed like cattle brought before a slaughterhouse? Or did time run ahead and they simply had to sit and wait? So that's my analysis. I want you to look back on your own analysis and see what you've been able to get out of the poem. I haven't pulled out every single authorial choice. There are a few more, but that's an idea of how to make sense of the poem and where you can start.